My ex-husband was standing next to the woman who used to be my closest friend when he glanced at the invitation in my hand and said, "Let me guess. You're hunting for a rich husband tonight." That was the opening line of my Saturday evening. It was 6:40 p.m., and I was standing at the check-in table for the Franklin Family House Gala in downtown Columbus, quietly regretting the shoes I'd chosen instead of the flats sitting uselessly in my closet. I wore a navy dress I'd found on clearance 3 weeks earlier and the pearl studs my mother had left me. Nothing flashy. Nothing meant to prove a point. Rick had apparently decided otherwise. Melissa stood at his elbow in burgundy silk that likely cost more than my very first car, her hand resting on his forearm the way it always seemed to, like it had never belonged anywhere else. That same hand had once passed me a coffee mug across my kitchen table on 100 ordinary mornings. Life has a strange sense of humor, not always a kind one. Melissa spotted me first. Her smile arrived slowly, deliberately. "Claire," she said, "I had no idea you'd be here tonight." Nothing in the words themselves was cruel. That was always her gift. She could cut you and make it sound like she was offering you cream for your coffee. Then Rick turned. For one long second, neither of us spoke. He looked both familiar and like a stranger, more silver at his temples, a tuxedo that fit like it had been tailored twice, and the posture of a man who'd spent so many years walking into rooms where people already knew his name that he now expected it everywhere. His eyes dropped to my invitation. Then came the smirk, and the line about the rich husband. Melissa gave a short laugh, not a real one, more of a courtesy laugh, the kind you offer your boss. I looked at Rick. There was a version of me, the version from 18 months ago, who would have fired something back immediately. Something about having my own income. Something about being invited on my own merit. Something sharp enough that he'd think twice before saying it again. And then I'd have spent the whole ride home wondering if I'd sounded too defensive, too bitter, too much like the woman he clearly still expected me to be. Divorce teaches you strange, useful things. One of them is that not every insult deserves a rebuttal. So instead, I turned to the young woman behind the check-in table and handed her my invitation. "Claire Bennett," I said, "thank you." She scanned the code on a small handheld device. Then she paused, frowned faintly, and scanned it again. For about 2 seconds, my stomach dropped. Maybe Daniel's assistant had made an error. Maybe my code had expired. Maybe I was about to become the middle-aged woman arguing with a 23-year-old over a charity gala invitation while my ex-husband enjoyed the show. Instead, the young woman straightened, glanced at me once more, then lifted a small radio clipped to her shoulder and said quietly, "Let the chairman know she's arrived." Behind me, Rick asked, "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" I turned to face him. "I imagine it means I'm here." His forehead creased. Melissa's smile disappeared entirely. Before either of them could say anything else, Daniel Mercer was crossing the lobby toward us. Daniel was 67, tall, silver-haired, and one of those men who had spent an entire career building something substantial without ever needing anyone to be reminded of it. He'd stepped down from running Mercer Office Supply 6 years earlier and had somehow gotten busier ever since. The moment he saw me, his whole expression shifted. "There she is." He took both my hands and pulled me into a quick embrace. "You actually came. I told you I would." People say all sorts of things once formalwear is involved. He laughed, then glanced briefly at Rick before turning his attention fully back to me. "Claire, I need 5 minutes upstairs before we start." That caught me off guard. "Now?" "Afraid so." He motioned to a staff member nearby. "Rachel, would you walk Claire up to the small conference room? I'll join you shortly." I nodded and followed her toward the elevator. Rick stepped forward. "Daniel." Daniel offered him a perfectly polite, perfectly brief smile. "Rick, good to see you." And that was it, no extended handshake, no small talk. I noticed, because I had known this man for 26 years, and I knew exactly what it looked like when Rick realized he'd been dismissed. The elevator doors closed, and I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. 18 months earlier, I might have paid good money to watch Rick's confusion as someone important hurried across a room for me. Back then, I still let myself imagine the moment he'd finally understand what he'd thrown away. Mostly now, though, I just felt worn out. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending years wanting someone to regret losing you. Rick and I had been married for 20 years. We met when I was 24 and he was 27, driving a pickup truck that stalled every time the temperature dropped, wearing one of 3 good shirts he owned in rotation, running a construction outfit that consisted of him, one employee, and me answering the phone from our kitchen table. I kept the books. I typed invoices after our daughter went to sleep. I delivered sandwiches to job sites and sat through endless dinners with bankers and suppliers who always shook Rick's hand first and mine second, if at all. To be fair, Rick worked himself half to death building that company. I've never needed to rewrite history to feel better about myself. But I helped build the life that let him do it, and somewhere along the way, we both stopped remembering that. By the time Bennett Commercial Construction had a real office, 30 employees, and its name on job site signs across central Ohio, I had quietly become something Rick introduced rather than something he consulted. My wife, Claire. That was usually the entire biography anyone got. Then came Melissa. She'd been my closest friend for nearly 2 decades. She knew where the spare key was hidden. She knew how I took my coffee. She sat beside me in a hospital waiting room the week my mother was dying, and she brought food to my house afterward because I couldn't remember to feed myself. That's the part people rarely understand about betrayal. It isn't just what someone does to you. It's everything they knew about you before they decided to do it anyway. The marriage finally split apart over messages. Months of them, nothing graphic, nothing you'd need to censor on television. The one sentence that stayed lodged in my chest was almost boring in its cruelty. Rick had written, "Claire wouldn't get it." Melissa had answered, "She never really got you." I read that exchange 3 times. Melissa, the woman who'd sat in my kitchen until midnight listening to me complain about Rick's snoring, our daughter's college applications, my mother's chemo schedule, and whether the dishwasher sounded off. Apparently, I'd misunderstood my entire marriage the whole time. Rick swore nothing physical happened until after we separated. Maybe that was even true. I stopped trying to verify it. Once your husband starts explaining the precise technical category of his own betrayal, the marriage is already finished in every way that matters. The elevator opened, and Rachel led me down a quiet corridor to a conference room overlooking a slice of the ballroom below. Through the glass, I could see round tables dressed in white linen, servers weaving between them, early guests beginning to find their seats. Daniel arrived less than a minute later and shut the door behind him. The easy humor from downstairs was gone. "Claire," he said, "we have a problem." My first thought went straight to the fundraising match. Did one of the matching donors pull out? No, he pulled out a chair for me. Unfortunately, this involves Rick. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he slid a printed email across the table. Before I picked it up, I need to explain how I'd ended up in that room to begin with, because 18 months earlier, nobody at Franklin Family House knew my name. For a while, honestly, I wasn't entirely sure I did either. The divorce had been fair, which sounds far better than it actually felt. We sold the house. We split the retirement accounts. I walked away with my share of the marital assets and a modest inheritance from my mother. I wasn't destitute. I also wasn't sitting on some quiet fortune. After legal fees, a down payment on a 2-bedroom condo in Worthington, and several uncomfortable meetings with a financial advisor, the verdict was that I'd be fine. Fine and finished working forever at 51 turned out to be 2 very different things, and that bothered me more than I expected. I'd worked before my daughter Emily was born, bookkeeping, office administration, payroll. I'd also done plenty for Rick's company over the years, especially in the early days. But paperwork has a short memory. When nobody's issued you a W-2 in decades, some people treat you like you spent 20 years arranging decorative throw pillows. I went on interviews. Several. One hiring manager, maybe 35 years old, looked at my resume and asked, not unkindly but not gently either, "So you haven't worked full-time since 2003. I smiled. Not anywhere that sent me a Christmas card, no. He blinked. I didn't get that job, probably for the best. Eventually, a dentist named Dr. Patel hired me 3 days a week to manage billing and bookkeeping at his practice in Worthington. The pay wasn't glamorous. Neither was the waiting room, which featured a fake ficus tree that appeared to have been collecting dust since roughly the second Bush administration. But the first time I held a paycheck with my own name printed on it, I sat in my car in the parking lot and stared at it far longer than I'd like to admit. It wasn't the amount, it was the fact that it was mine. The first month was rough. Half the software had changed since I'd last used anything like it. I kept scribbling passwords on sticky notes, then hiding those sticky notes so carefully I couldn't find them again. One of the younger assistants finally said, gently, "Claire, you can save those somewhere secure, you know." "I was saving things securely before you were born," I told her. She laughed. It helped more than she probably realized. Around that same time, I started volunteering one afternoon a week at Franklin Family House. My sister had spent weeks in a similar program years earlier, back when her son was undergoing cancer treatment in Cleveland. That kind of housing gave them a bed, breakfast, transportation, and most importantly, one less thing to worry about while they were already terrified. You don't forget what real, practical kindness looks like when a family is frightened and far from home. At Franklin, I started small, checking families in, restocking cereal boxes, answering phones, folding an endless supply of donated towels. Once I spent a solid 15 minutes helping a grandmother from Dayton wrestle with a stubborn washing machine. She slapped the lid and announced, "I raised 4 children. I refuse to be defeated by a maid egg." I liked her instantly. I liked the place too. Nobody there knew me as Rick Bennett's wife. Nobody asked what had happened in my marriage. They asked if I could carry a box. I could, that was enough. A few months in, Franklin began serious planning for a $4.8 million expansion, chaired by Daniel Mercer. One afternoon, while sorting through budget materials, I noticed a vendor estimate that didn't sit right. I checked it again, then asked Daniel, "Does this electrical figure already include the work listed on the previous page?" He frowned. "Why?" "Because I think they've counted part of it twice." He checked, then he checked again. They had. Daniel looked at me the way you'd look at someone who just pulled a rabbit out of a filing cabinet. "How did you catch that?" I shrugged. 26 years married to a contractor. Eventually, drywall becomes a personality trait. That was the beginning. He started inviting me to planning meetings, then to the Capital Campaign Committee. At first, I kept asking, "Are you sure about this?" Eventually, he just said, "Claire, if I weren't sure, I'd stop inviting you." Fair enough. I understood construction. I understood budgets. And whether Rick had ever noticed or not, I understood people. For years, I'd sat beside him at dinners with bankers, suppliers, retired executives, hospital board members, and clients. Rick remembered which men shook his hand firmly. I remembered their wives' names, their kids' schools, which causes they quietly cared about, who despised golf, who collected vintage cars, and who always ordered decaf, and then complained it tasted like punishment. It turned out that mattered a great deal. When Daniel began searching for donors willing to anchor a matching campaign, I introduced him to 2 retired business owners I'd known for years. Together, they agreed to establish a $1 million matching challenge. My own contribution was smaller, $100,000 over 3 years. That was not pocket change for me. I met with my financial advisor twice before committing. The first time, she said, "You know you don't have to prove anything." "I know," I told her. The second time I said, "I'm not proving anything, I want to do this." She nodded, "Then let's make sure you can afford to." That mattered too. I asked Daniel not to attach my name to anything, no plaque, no donor wall, no announcement. He thought I was being overly modest. I told him I was being practical. The truth was simpler than that. I wanted one single part of my life that didn't somehow circle back to a conversation about Rick. For nearly a year, Franklin Family House was exactly that. Then, 3 months before the gala, Bennett Commercial Construction submitted a bid for a portion of the expansion. The moment I saw the company name on the list, I went straight to Daniel. "I can't be involved in this." He understood immediately. Agreed. I signed the formal conflict of interest disclosure. I stopped attending any meeting where Rick's bid came up. I never saw pricing. I never reviewed a single proposal. I never asked who was ahead. I stayed completely, deliberately out of it. That should have been the end of the problem. It wasn't. About 2 weeks before the gala, I ran into Melissa at a coffee shop near High Street. I was waiting on my order when she appeared beside me. Well, she said, look who's suddenly everywhere. Good morning, Melissa. She ordered something so elaborate it practically required a permit. Then, casually, she said, Rick's feeling very good about the Franklin bid. I wouldn't know. Right, you're not involved, she smiled. He know. He's going to win. There was something in the way she said no's. I noticed it, then told myself firmly not to read into it. Rick had always carried a certain confidence, sometimes an obnoxious amount of it. But after 26 years, I knew the difference between his public confidence and the particular version he wore when he believed he held an advantage nobody else knew about. I'd watched that exact expression across negotiating tables more times than I could count. For half a second I wondered what he knew. Then I did something the divorce had finally taught me. I minded my own business. Not every strange comment from an ex-husband requires a full investigation. Which brings us back to that upstairs conference room. By the time I stood across from Daniel that Saturday night, I wasn't Rick Bennett's discarded ex-wife sneaking into someone else's fundraiser. I'd spent nearly a year quietly helping build that entire campaign. Rick simply had no idea. Daniel tapped the printed page in front of me. I picked it up. At the top was the letterhead of Bennett Commercial's attorney. I read the first paragraph, then the second. By the third, I understood completely. They were questioning whether my role with the charity had influenced the bidding process. I looked up at Daniel. I haven't seen a single bid. I know. I signed the recusal. I know that too. His voice was steady but tired. I looked down at the page again. The language was careful. Nobody was technically accused of anything. That made it worse. There were only questions. Had the organization taken appropriate steps to guarantee impartiality? Had individuals with personal ties to bidders been properly excluded from discussions? Could Franklin confirm that no confidential information had been shared? I set the page down. This is insurance. Daniel leaned back. That's exactly my read on it too. If he wins, this letter disappears and nobody remembers it existed. If he loses, he already has his story ready. His bitter ex-wife interfered. Daniel nodded slowly. I pushed my chair back. Then maybe I shouldn't go back downstairs tonight. His expression hardened immediately. Why would you do that? Because there are 400 people in that room, Daniel. Donors, board members, contractors. Half of Columbus seems to know the other half. If this letter starts circulating, you followed every conflict of interest rule we have. I know what I did. Then what exactly are you worried about? What people will believe I did? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Claire, I am not asking you to disappear because someone else finds your existence inconvenient. That silenced me instantly, not because it was some profound revelation, but because it was embarrassingly familiar. For years, whenever Rick felt uncomfortable, I'd adjusted. I'd changed the subject, smoothed things over, made myself just slightly less visible so the evening would go more smoothly for everyone else. Apparently some habits outlive the marriage that created them. Daniel stood. Stay, eat dinner, let us handle the letter. You make that sound simple. No, I make it sound like my problem, not yours. He opened the door for me. Tonight your only problem is the chicken. That bad. I sat through the tasting. That actually pulled a laugh out of me. By the time I made it back downstairs, cocktail hour was winding down. I'd gotten maybe 20 feet toward the ballroom when Rick stepped directly into my path. What were you doing up there? Hello to you too. I'm serious, Claire, talking to Daniel about what my bid. About charity business. He studied my face the way he used to when he suspected I was hiding something. It used to bother me. Now it mostly annoyed me. I'm being straight with you. So am I. Melissa appeared at his side, holding a glass of white wine, glancing between the two of us. Is everything all right? Fine, I said. Rick said nothing. Melissa sighed the way you'd sigh at squabbling children. Claire, this really isn't the place to make things personal. I turned to her. Melissa, I was checking in on a fundraiser I've spent a year building. You two brought the personal part with you the second you walked in together. She opened her mouth, then apparently thought better of whatever was coming next. Rick lowered his voice. The contract is going to land where it should. There it was again, that certainty. Not hope, not simple confidence in his own company's work. Certainty. And suddenly I was back at that coffee shop with Melissa. He knows he's going to win. For one strange moment, I saw the version of Rick I'd studied across conference tables and restaurant booths for 26 years. That particular stillness he wore when he believed he had information nobody else had. I noticed it. Then I walked away. Dinner began at 7:30. My table held two board members, a retired pediatrician and his wife, a local insurance broker, and a couple Fr. Dublin, Ohio who'd supported Franklin for years. Nobody asked about my divorce. Nobody mentioned Rick's name. It was a small mercy, and Daniel had been entirely correct about the chicken. At 8:15, the room dimmed. Daniel took the stage, spoke briefly about the families Franklin had served that year, and showed renderings of the proposed expansion. Then he moved to the fundraising campaign itself. As many of you already know, he said, we walked in tonight with a $1 million matching challenge. Applause rippled through the room. He smiled. I have some news. Our matching donors have agreed tonight to raise that challenge to $1.5 million, provided we hit our goal before this evening ends. The applause grew louder. I sat up straighter. This part was news to me too. The woman beside me leaned over. Did you know about this? No, I admitted. Daniel continued. And there is someone in this room tonight who deserves an enormous amount of credit for bringing those donors to this table. My stomach dropped. I stared at him. We had discussed this more accurately. I had explicitly asked him not to, and he had complained about it at length. Across the ballroom, I watched Rick turn in his seat to follow Daniel's gaze. Melissa leaned toward him and whispered something. Daniel opened his mouth to continue. Then Franklin's executive director, Susan, appeared at the edge of the stage, not walking, but moving with clear purpose. Daniel noticed her immediately. She leaned in and said something quiet. His smile vanished. He set the microphone back on its stand. Excuse me just one moment. Conversation erupted across the room the instant he stepped away. Susan came straight for my table. Claire, could you come with us, please? My stomach dropped further. I followed her, and Daniel through a service door beside the ballroom. Daniel held up his phone. One of our major donors just received this. Was an email. Attached were screenshots of internal Franklin correspondence, my name appearing in several of them. At a glance, they looked damning. One showed me discussing early expansion costs. Another showed me asking questions about contractor qualifications. A later message referenced Bennett Commercial directly. Whoever had assembled this had stripped out the dates, the replies, and any surrounding context. It appeared, at a glance, as though I'd been involved in the bidding process from start to finish. I hadn't been. These are all from before I recused myself. I know, Susan said. That last one isn't even related to Rick's bid, it's about the original preliminary budget. Does the donor know that? Daniel's expression answered before he spoke. We're finding out. We don't yet know how many other people received it. That was the part that genuinely frightened me. Not because I'd done anything wrong, because I understood, instantly, exactly how easy it would be to make it look as though I had. My quiet, anonymous involvement, the thing that had felt private and clean for nearly a year, could now be twisted into something secretive. Anonymous donor. Ex-wife, construction bid. Competing ex-husband. Arrange those facts in the wrong order and you could tell an entirely different, much uglier story. 10 minutes later, Susan returned with more details. The email hadn't gone to the whole room, just to one donor, who'd shown it to a board member sitting beside him, who then mentioned it to someone else. And from there, the rumor did exactly what rumors do once you put 400 people in formalware and hand them wine. It traveled. We're trying to contain it, Susan said. I nearly laughed at the word. You can contain water. You can contain an overexcited dog. A rumor loose in a ballroom is another matter entirely. Daniel had his staff pull the full original email thread to determine exactly who outside the organization had received the attachments. I stood near the service entrance while they worked, looking through the open doorway into the ballroom. Rick was speaking with a man at his table. Melissa sat beside him, phone in hand. I don't know exactly why I kept watching her. Maybe 20 years of friendship teaches you things too, even after it ends badly. She glanced toward the doorway and saw me. For one long second, neither of us moved. Then she flipped her phone face down on the tablecloth. And suddenly, Rick wasn't the only person I was wondering about. My first thought had gone straight to Rick. Motive was obvious enough. If he could cast doubt on my role before the contract was decided, he'd already have an explanation ready in case Bennett commercial lost. My second thought went to Melissa, and I hated that I genuinely couldn't tell which possibility unsettled me more. Rick had motive, but Melissa knew me. She knew precisely which accusation would land hardest. I started toward their table. Daniel caught my arm gently. "Where are you going?" "To ask Melissa a question." "Claire." "We don't accuse anyone until we actually know something." "I wasn't planning to accuse her." He raised one eyebrow. "Fine, I was planning to ask very pointedly." "Give it 10 minutes." I hated that this was good advice, mostly because it was good advice. I turned and walked to the women's restroom instead, where I found nothing but myself, the mirror, and an absurdly large arrangement of white roses by the sinks. For the first time all evening, I seriously considered leaving. Not dramatically, I wasn't going to storm out or fling my invitation at anyone. I simply wanted my coat, my car, and the quiet of my little condo in Worthington. Maybe getting involved with Franklin had been a mistake after all. Maybe I'd been fooling myself, thinking this one part of my life had nothing to do with Rick. Now his company was bidding on the project. His attorney was quietly questioning my integrity. And someone was circulating fragments of my old emails around a ballroom full of donors. I pulled out my phone to call a car. Before I could open the app, it rang. "Emily's." I nearly let it go to voicemail, then I answered. "Hi, honey." "Mom, are you at the Franklin Gala?" "Yes," I closed my eyes. "Your dad's here too." "I know," Melissa posted a picture. Of course she had. "Is Dad bothering you?" Emily asked. "No, everything's fine." Silence, then my daughter said quietly, "You always say that." I leaned against the counter. "I'm at a work dinner, Emily. I'm not going to drag you into whatever's happening between your father and me." "Mom," something in her voice stopped me cold. "I love Dad, you know I do." "I know. But you don't have to keep making him sound better than he was. For my sake." "I was trying not to make you choose between us." "I'm 27, Mom. I can love someone and still know exactly when they were wrong." That landed harder than I expected. I'd spent most of Emily's life believing that protecting her meant quietly absorbing whatever I could before it ever reached her. Somewhere along the way, I think I'd confused protecting my daughter with protecting Rick. "I have to go," I said. "Okay, are you okay?" I laughed despite myself. "There you go again." "I love you, Mom." "Love you too." I put the phone away. I didn't suddenly feel brave. I still wanted badly to go home, but I stopped reaching for that rideshare app. When I stepped back into the hallway, Susan was waiting. "We found it." Daniel joined us as she held up her tablet. The original attachments were sent to Melissa. I stared at the screen. How? About 6 weeks earlier, apparently, a Franklin staff member had accidentally copied Melissa on an internal chain while distributing gala materials to a volunteer list. The thread had included several outdated attachments from the early planning stage. Melissa had no reason to have received them. She'd also had no reason to keep them, but she had. And the email sent to the donor that evening had come directly from her personal account. For a moment, I said nothing. 20 years of birthdays, holidays, hospital waiting rooms, and coffee at my kitchen table, and somehow this was where it had all landed. "We need to speak with her privately," Daniel said. He looked at me. "I think you should be there." Melissa arrived in the upstairs conference room 10 minutes later. Rick came with her. The instant she saw me sitting beside Daniel, her expression told me she already knew why. "What is this?" Susan closed the door. We need to ask you about an email sent tonight. Melissa glanced at Rick, who looked genuinely confused. Susan slid a printed copy across the table. Rick picked it up. What in the world is this? Nobody answered him. Susan turned back to Melissa. Did you send this? Melissa folded her arms. I gave someone information they had every right to know. Rick stared at her. You did this. I was protecting you. From what? He looked genuinely lost. From her. I almost admired how simply she said it. Melissa, he's 55. He's a contractor, not an endangered species. Daniel studied the table intently. Susan suddenly found the papers in front of her fascinating. Rick didn't laugh. This isn't funny. No, I said, it really isn't. Melissa leaned toward me. You've been trying to make him look bad ever since the divorce. By doing exactly what? She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. I waited. Tonight so far, I've checked in politely, eaten half a chicken breast, and been quietly accused of manipulating a bid I've never even seen. Which part precisely was my attack? Rick turned on her. You had absolutely no right to send that. Her expression shifted instantly. Oh, don't you dare. What? Don't stand there pretending you're innocent. Rick went very still. Melissa laughed once sharply. Tell them. He didn't move. Tell them why you were so sure you'd win. The room went quiet, and suddenly I was back at that coffee shop. He knows he's going to win. I looked at Rick. What is she talking about? Nothing. Melissa's voice cut through. The spreadsheet, Rick. Daniel straightened. What spreadsheet? Rick rubbed a hand over his jaw. Slowly, he explained that 2 months earlier, he'd had drinks with a former estimator who'd recently left one of the competing companies. The man had shown him a portion of a spreadsheet, preliminary numbers, pricing assumptions. Rick insisted he hadn't asked to see any of it. Daniel asked one question. Did you photograph it? Rick hesitated just long enough to answer the question without saying a word. Finally, a portion. Susan stared at him. You photographed a competitor's internal pricing information. They weren't final numbers. That's not the point, Daniel said, his voice remarkably calm. I never used any of it. Still not the point. Rick looked at me, as though I might somehow translate the situation into something more forgivable. I couldn't. For years, I'd watched him push right up against a line because he genuinely believed that not technically crossing it was the same thing as behaving honorably. Maybe, at some point, I'd even helped him believe that. How much did you actually use? I asked. I told you I didn't use it. Then why photograph it in the first place? He had no answer for that either. Melissa sat back, looking almost satisfied now that Rick was in trouble too. It might have been the saddest thing I witnessed all night. Daniel stood. The procurement committee is going to suspend the process while we conduct a full review. Rick's head snapped toward him. Daniel, come on. You know my company, Rick said. I do. You've built a solid reputation in this city over 30 years, which is exactly why you should have known better. Rick's jaw tightened. Then he looked at me, not with anger this time, but something closer to worry. Claire, can we talk privately? I picked up my purse. We were private for 26 years, Rick. I walked toward the door. Look how that turned out. He followed me into the hallway anyway. Claire, please. I stopped. I probably shouldn't have. By that point, I'd heard enough of his explanations to last through several retirements. But there was one thing I actually wanted to understand, so I turned around. He glanced toward the closed conference room. I didn't know Melissa was going to send that. I believe you. That clearly surprised him. Then you understand. Don't get too excited. He closed his mouth. I believe you didn't send the email, I said. I also believe your attorney reached out to the board and suggested I might be interfering with your bid. I had to protect the company. From what exactly? You were suddenly involved. Nobody told me how involved. You could have asked. You wouldn't have told me. You never asked. He looked away, and there it was, the same old argument wearing new clothes. For years, Rick had been exceptionally skilled at deciding what I thought without ever bothering to ask me directly. Why did you assume I'd interfere? I asked. He rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know. Yes, you do. He glanced toward the ballroom, then finally admitted, because I thought you hated me. That nearly made me laugh. I did, I said, for a while, then I got busy. He actually flinched, not because it was cruel, but because I meant every word of it. Claire, this could hurt a lot of people. Then you should have thought about that before photographing someone else's pricing sheet. I told you, those weren't final numbers. And Daniel already told you that isn't the point. He exhaled hard. I made a mistake. Yes, you did. I said it easily, and he seemed almost offended by how quickly I agreed. Then came the part I should have seen coming. Can you talk to Daniel? Tell him this got blown out of proportion. Tell him you know me. Tell him I'd never cheat a children's charity. For a second I saw us 15 years earlier, Rick getting too sharp with a subcontractor, Rick offending a client at dinner, Rick saying something careless at a school fundraiser, and me quietly smoothing it over afterward. He didn't mean it that way. He's under a lot of pressure. You know how he gets. I had spent years translating him into a kinder language than he'd earned. You clearly also thought I'd never end up divorced from my own best friend's future husband, I said. My track record for reading you correctly isn't exactly flawless these days. His jaw tightened. Melissa and I didn't start anything until after we were all ready. I held up a hand. No, we're not doing this, not tonight. You brought up the marriage. I made one comparison. You're the one trying to drag a 26-year relationship into a conversation you'd rather not have about tonight. That stopped him. We're talking about the letter your lawyer sent, I said. Stay there. He looked at me for a long moment, and then his shoulders finally dropped. What do you want me to do? Once, that question would have thrilled me. Standing there, I realized I didn't want anything from him at all. That's between you and the board, I said, and went back inside. The committee deliberated for another 20 minutes. There was no dramatic vote taken in front of the ballroom, no security escort, no one threatening to call the police. Real institutions are almost always far less theatrical than people imagine. Mostly it's policies, attorneys, and people repeating the phrase, risk exposure, until everyone in the room wants a second drink. In the end, the committee decided the procurement process would pause for an independent review. Because Rick had possessed a competitor's internal pricing information, Bennett Commercial could no longer participate cleanly. He had two choices: withdraw voluntarily, or force the board to formally disqualify the company and document exactly why. Rick chose to withdraw. He wasn't happy about it. He also wasn't foolish enough to force the alternative. By then, though, the rumor about me had spread through enough of the ballroom that Daniel had a separate problem to manage. He couldn't simply resume dinner and pretend nothing had happened, and he certainly wasn't going to turn a charity gala into a courtroom drama. So he returned to the microphone. I stood near the edge of the ballroom. Rick had gone back to his table. Melissa's chair sat empty. I want to address something briefly, Daniel said, and explained without naming anyone that the construction procurement process had been paused to ensure fairness and transparency, that one bidder had withdrawn, and that an independent review would be completed before the project moved forward. No accusations. No names. No public spectacle. Then he changed direction entirely. Now, he said, let's get back to why we're actually here tonight. He looked directly at me, then he stepped away from the microphone and crossed the room toward my table. Claire, may I finally say your name? I knew exactly what he was asking. 6 months earlier, my answer would have been automatic. That night, I looked around the room at Rick, at the families Franklin had helped, at the volunteers and staff I'd spent nearly a year working alongside. Yes, I said. Daniel returned to the stage and explained the matching challenge in full. Then he told the room that I had helped connect Franklin with the donors who'd made the increased match possible. He described the budget work, the campaign meetings, and my $100,000 commitment over 3 years. He also made a point of explaining that I had formally recused myself from every discussion involving Bennett Commercial the moment its bid appeared. Then he said something I hadn't anticipated. Some people walk into a room hoping everyone already knows exactly who they are. Claire spent the better part of a year quietly asking us not to tell anybody at all. People laughed softly, then they applauded. Nobody leapt onto a chair. There was no cinematic standing ovation. Mostly people simply clapped. But near the back of the room, a woman named Denise rose to her feet. Her 8-year-old son had spent 11 weeks in treatment that spring, and I'd checked her into Franklin on a Tuesday afternoon when she hadn't slept properly in 3 days. Then an older man named Walter stood, whose granddaughter had also stayed with us. A handful of volunteers followed. That was the moment that truly got to me. Not the donors, not Rick's expression, not even Daniel's speech. Them. I looked across the ballroom one last time. Rick was watching me, and I could see the exact instant he understood what had actually happened upstairs. I hadn't walked into that gala hoping to gain access to wealthy people. I was one of the people who'd helped bring them there in the first place. Later, near the registration table, Rick found me again. For once, he didn't look angry. "I didn't know," he said quietly. I picked up my coat. "That was always part of our problem, Rick. You stopped asking." He glanced back toward the ballroom. "Mercer really was waiting for you tonight, wasn't he?" I allowed myself a small smile. Apparently, then I left. No champagne thrown in anyone's face. No mysterious millionaire waiting outside to fall madly in love with me. Just my own car, parked on the 4th level of a concrete garage. I climbed in, kicked off those ridiculous shoes, dropped them on the passenger side floor, and sat there for almost 10 minutes without starting the engine. I'd imagined moments like this one plenty of times since the divorce, Rick finally seeing me differently, Rick understanding exactly what he'd lost. I always assumed it would feel like winning. It didn't. Mostly, I just felt tired. And then, slowly, something lighter crept in underneath the exhaustion because he had finally seen me, and somehow that mattered far less than it used to. The next morning at 8:17, I was drinking coffee when my knee buzzed. "Melissa, one sentence. You won, are you happy?" I typed 3 different replies and deleted every single one. Then I set the phone face down on the counter, because for the first time, I understood something Melissa apparently still hadn't figured out. There had never been a contest to begin with. The formal review took 4 weeks, which probably tells you more about real life than anything else in this story. The big, dramatic moments happen on a Saturday night under chandelier lighting. The actual consequences arrive on ordinary Tuesdays, buried in emails with attachments. Franklin Family House brought in an outside attorney to review the entire bidding process, meeting minutes, emails, access logs, conflict disclosures, and enough paperwork to make anyone regret the invention of committees. My part of the story was simple and clean. I had disclosed my relationship to Bennett Commercial the instant the company entered the bidding process. I had signed the recusal. I hadn't attended a single bid meeting, reviewed a single price, or communicated with any competing contractor. In other words, I had done precisely what I'd said I would do. Melissa's part was equally clear. She had received material she never should have had, kept it for weeks, then selectively assembled fragments of old correspondence and sent them without any of the context that would have shown when and why I'd actually been involved. Franklin quietly removed her from all volunteer responsibilities. No lawsuit, no police report, no dramatic scene of someone being escorted out of a building. They simply told her they no longer trusted her with anything confidential. Sometimes that single sentence does more damage than shouting ever could. Rick's situation was messier. The review couldn't prove that Bennett Commercial had directly copied a competitor's actual bid numbers, and technically, Rick was right that the figures he'd seen were only preliminary. But the review did confirm that he had knowingly possessed a competitor's internal information and failed to disclose it. As a result, Bennett Commercial was removed from consideration for the Franklin project entirely. That was the consequence, not bankruptcy, not ruin. His company kept operating. His employees kept their jobs, which genuinely mattered to me. Some of those people had been there 15 or 20 years. They had mortgages, children, and aging parents to worry about. None of them deserved to lose anything, because Rick had convinced himself a line didn't count until both feet were fully across it. But Columbus's business community is smaller than people assume. Word traveled, even if the specific details didn't always survive the retelling. A couple of nonprofit board members grew noticeably less eager to recommend Bennett commercial for future work. One developer reportedly asked Rick a few uncomfortable questions of his own. His company survived. His reputation picked up a permanent dent. I could live with that outcome. As for Rick and Melissa, I heard through mutual acquaintances that things between them grew difficult in the weeks following the gala. Rick blamed her for sending the email in the first place. Melissa blamed him for retreating from her the instant things became embarrassing. I never asked for updates, which apparently surprised people. One old friend called and said, "Don't you want to know what's happening with them?" Not particularly. Oh, come on, why not? If they're making each other miserable, I said, they don't need my supervision. She laughed so hard she had to set the phone down for a moment. There are certain forms of revenge you really shouldn't interfere with. A few weeks after the gala, Emily drove up from Cincinnati one Sunday morning with a bag of pastries and an immediate announcement that my coffee was terrible. My coffee is perfectly fine. Mom, you buy whatever's on sale. That's not a coffee philosophy, that's a survival strategy. She made a fresh pot anyway, and we carried our mugs out to my small balcony, 2 chairs, a tiny table, and a planter I'd been unsuccessfully trying to keep alive since May. Emily tucked one leg underneath herself. Dad called me, she said. I felt my shoulders tense before I could stop them. I don't want to be put in the middle of anything. I know, but whatever happened between the two of you, Mom, she stopped herself, then continued more carefully. He said you embarrassed him publicly. I stared into my mug. I didn't. I know that. That made me look up. Emily shrugged. I asked him what actually happened. And what did he say? He got very quiet. I laughed despite myself. Emily smiled too, but only briefly. Then her expression turned more serious. Can I say something without you trying to fix it? That's an ominous request. Mom! Fine, go ahead. She set her mug down. I need you to stop protecting Dad when you talk to me. I don't protect him. You do, I opened my mouth tea. Oh, argue, then remembered our phone call outside that restroom and closed it again. You did it through the entire divorce, she continued. You'd say things like your dad's under a lot of pressure, or there are two sides to everything, or don't be angry with him because of me. I never wanted you to think I was asking you to choose. I wasn't asking you to choose either, she said gently. I love Dad, he's my father, but I'm an adult now. I can love someone and still be honest about when he behaves badly. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought I was helping. I know you did. There wasn't much else to say after that, so I reached over and squeezed her hand. After a moment, she nodded toward the sad little planter between us. Is that basil? It was. What happened to it? I think it took a side. That finally broke the tension, and we both laughed until the coffee went cold. By spring, Franklin Family House had selected a new contractor, and construction began in April. The campaign ultimately exceeded its goal, thanks in part to that expanded matching challenge. I kept my job at Dr. Patel's office 3 days a week, not because I had to anymore, but because I wanted to. There was something steadying about knowing exactly where I needed to be on a Tuesday morning. Eventually, Daniel talked me into formally joining Franklin's board. During my first official meeting, he leaned over and whispered, "Now can we finally put your name on something? Maybe a broom closet." Already sponsored. Of course it is. A few months later, I ran into Rick at the grocery store, of all places, the coffee aisle. No tuxedo, no Melissa, no chairman waiting to greet him, just Rick standing there comparing 2 nearly identical bags of coffee that differed in price by roughly $3. For some reason, that struck me as almost funny. This was the man who had once seemed capable of determining the entire shape of my future happiness, now visibly agonizing over whether the Colombian roast was worth the upcharge. Claire. Hi, Rick. We stood there for a moment, both a little awkward. Then he said, "I've been meaning to apologize." I waited. He looked uncomfortable. Good apologies had apparently never made it onto his list of acquired skills. Finally, he said, "I underestimated you." I thought about that for a second, then shook my head. "You didn't underestimate me, Rick." He frowned. "Then what did I do?" "You stopped seeing me at all." He didn't have an answer for that, and remarkably, I found I didn't need one. I placed my coffee in the cart and kept shopping. For a long time after the divorce, I used to picture revenge in very specific terms. Rick would see me thriving. He'd regret Melissa. He'd finally, fully grasp how much I had actually contributed to our marriage. He'd understand exactly what he had lost. It took me an embarrassingly long time to notice that every single one of those fantasies still placed Rick at the very center of my imagined future. His regret was still the prize I was chasing. That's what genuinely changed for me the night of that gala. Not because Daniel Mercer knew my name. Not because a room full of donors applauded. And certainly not because Rick looked embarrassed in front of people who mattered to him. It changed the moment the man I'd spent 26 years married to tried, once again, to make me feel small. And I realized, clearly and completely, that I no longer had to convince him otherwise. That young hostess had scanned my invitation twice and murmured into her radio, "Let the chairman know she's arrived." For most of my marriage, I think some part of me had been quietly waiting for someone to announce me exactly like that, to tell the whole room that I mattered. At 52, I finally understood something simpler than that. You don't need anyone's permission to belong in a life you built with your own two hands. Sometimes all you actually have to do is show up. If you've ever had someone mistake your silence for weakness, or discovered that starting over is nothing at all like starting from nothing, then you already know exactly what I mean.